AI was also a very important technology that we wanted to get your input on because some of the students are actually looking at this. And somehow I know it's very hard to predict the future. It's a kind of a funny business, but it seems like that's something that if there is anybody that can do, that's actually David for us. So thank you for being here.
Pleasure, pleasure. So I'm not an expert on AI, though I did learn some rudimentary Python programming during the lockdown, getting to the point now where I feel like I do need to work under the hood a little bit. So throughout the summer, I've been messing with some of the AI code that's out there on like GitHub. If you don't know GitHub, GitHub is like the general open source repository for everybody that's using AI. They're uploading code to GitHub. So it's there for you to play around with if any of you get into this stuff. Today, I just want to represent the work of me and my partner, Karel Klein, and maybe not give such a, I guess, a nerdy talk, but I mean, there's plenty of time to go into the technicalities, and there's quite a bit of that, you know, we can cover at some later point. But I'm more interested in just general implications for design and for creative practice. And so I'm gonna start out by talking about some of the, I guess you would say, theoretical background of what might be at stake here for us. So I'm gonna share screen and we can get into it. Okay. All right, so you see the screen, right? Fictional realities. Okay, we're good, right? Okay. I call it fictional realities because after thinking about this pretty much for my whole career, the thing I always return to about architecture is it's the preeminent practice of editing reality. And I'm gonna try to get more into why I reduce it to that. Let's start with this picture. This is a project by some photojournalists, and they've been documenting Pyongyang, North Korea. And what's pretty bizarre about Pyongyang is it's such a extreme propaganda state. The graphic design regimes of state propaganda has now influenced how they, I guess, build and color their actual physical reality. They're basically designing their city to match the propaganda, which is utterly bizarre. You know, I don't think we've ever seen anything quite this extreme. But to some degree, I think this happens in more or less, you know, similar ways, I think, in general. Maybe not for such extreme totalitarian politics, but I think architecture is a kind of field for broadcasting our mental images of a possible reality into lived reality. And so I think there's quite a bit at stake, I always thought, in how we make our images, how we make our representations. Eventually, I think it gets out there. And I say reality because I think most of our lived experiences are in the presence of constructed environments. We're almost never in a kind of untouched natural state. I think it's just almost a kind of inescapable bubble of imagination that we live in. So last week I talked briefly about collaboration we did in the past with synthetic biologists. I only bring this up again because this more recent interest in artificial intelligence is just part of a 20-year-long obsession interest in the relationship between architecture and technology and how it impacts what we think the outside world is. And so that led to things like this, which was collaboration with synthetic biologists to make a flesh printing machine. It led to collaborations with this one, it's still kind of weirdly ongoing, But this company, they had proprietary technology for generating electricity from tidal changes in these artificial basins, lagoons that would have to be built. But they came to us just wanting, I guess, almost like a marketing help, you know, like, can you maybe help us rethink just the culture of their technology to make it more acceptable, because they're having a really hard time proposing building a giant machine in the middle of the water, you know. Yeah, and there've been kind of wide range of extreme to simplified versions of this that we've been producing images for primarily. So let's get into images for a second, because I think the primary, most accessible way of thinking about artificial intelligence, I think, is through this topic of what is now primarily technical images that we're working with. So this is a point that John May makes, which I think is an excellent one. Some of you may have read his essay, which is almost seminal now, published in Log. It's called Everything is Already an Image. And he points out something very obvious, but something that we don't really think of, which is what we call photographs that we take on our iPhones, et cetera, is actually not photographs. What photographs used to be is actual photons, that is literal light, bending through an aperture onto photosensitive emulsion, which then has to be chemically developed. And it is literally light painting, as he points out. So and I agree that he says it's more properly should be termed heliography, that is light drawing. Whereas what we have now is more what's represented by the image on the right, which is a photosensor. And if you do a little bit of digging into how photosensors work, I mean, one is absolutely magnificent how clever it is. But what it's actually doing is it's converting light as I guess, a radiation, and interpreting it as a signal that has to then be transformed into numerical data. So what we're talking about when we're using our iPhones or photoshopping or rendering is less heliography, in fact, nothing to do with heliography ultimately, but should be thought of more properly speaking as signal processing. So because it is signal processing, I think it was really just a matter of time until we started thinking about how that data could be transformed in progressively more sophisticated ways. And the world of artificial intelligence is one such way where the signal processing can be done in a different way. So this is a famous painting by Andreas Gursky. And at one time, I actually talked about it a couple of years ago at a different thesis talk. But this Gursky painting, I almost said painting, well, photograph, let's call it a photograph still, nonetheless. This Gursky photograph at one time was the most expensive sold art photograph ever. And it is also, I guess the historical significance of it is one of the first digitally manipulated photographs in the art world. So what he did here was he took multiple photographs on medium format, scanned it, and then very carefully, I guess we would say, photoshopped it or signal processed it to make it completely seamless. So I guess in a previous era, we would call it a collage, but the seamlessness that's afforded by this digital signal processing, I think brings it into our contemporary era, which is not really about collage. Because when you look at a collage, you're looking for that disjunction, you're looking at the cut marks, you're looking at the superposition and the breakdown of the image into multiple layers and multiple image objects. This is something else entirely, where it becomes coherent as a single piece of data. This is another important piece by Gursky, and this is a photograph of the Rhine. And people have remarked about a similarity to a Barnett Newman painting, for example, and Barnett Newman is kind of known for kind of painterly contemporary modernist sublime. And so it is interesting to think about Gursky's practice as also kind of aesthetics of the sublime. But what's interesting, again, about this is highly manipulated. So through digital signal processing, basically this is the Rhine as we know it. He basically subtracted pretty much everything. Yeah. And so it's a kind of weirdly a new form of abstraction, although it's debatable if the word abstraction is even appropriate anymore because of how he's doing this work. Now, this is still just manual work to some degree because it's Gursky's photographing, scanning, and then brushing in Photoshop and edge matching and all that, you know. It's kind of a simulation of our past lived experiences of orthographic techniques. And still hasn't entered into the brave new world we have now. There's so much of this going on. So for the past decade, I've been just fascinated by what's happening in the world of art photography. This is an image made by a collective of Dutch artists where the idea was to artificially construct basically doctor photographs, I guess is another way to say it, to make scenes that were aerial photographs of scenes from the Bible. So this is supposed to be, as you could guess, the parting of the Red Sea. This one's self-evident. This one's supposed to be Garden of Eden, and this one was supposed to be Noah's Ark. But I thought this was utterly fascinating to think about, like this. I don't know how religious some of you are, but you know, these fictional narratives from the Old Testament now like brought into this regime of realism. And I guess what I find so interesting about this phenomena in contemporary art photography is the positioning of reality as nothing more than a compositional style. Which of course begs the question, so then what the hell is reality, right? Another great artist doing this kind of stuff is Cedric Delceau, who photoshops characters from Star Wars very carefully into gritty, realist urban scenes. In some ways, it's like a similar agenda. Yeah, I love this one. Gregory Crutzen, similar, like maybe like a reversed operation, but similar topics where he's been living in the small town and asked people if he could take their photographs after he gets to know them. And, but, you know, what kind of town is this? Well, this is an actual woman in this town, but when he decides to take a portrait, he completely reconstructs their home and their environment as a stage set. So sometimes it's been discussed as like a hyper-realist. You know? So you could see a lot of people are just messing with the representation of reality and how do we even capture that reality. But all of it, underlying it, is relying on this digital edifice. You know? So I think ultimately what this line of inquiry led me to is, all right, I have to look at how data is actually being manipulated now, which is primarily through artificial intelligence. So you know about things like this, the hemispherical camera of Google Street View. You may not know, like these things are for the most part automated now. And when your project is to photograph the entire world, you're gonna occasionally photograph some weird things happening. And you may have noticed when you look on Google Street View or Google Earth, you never really see things out of the ordinary, you know? So you don't notice to what degree it's been moderated and scrubbed of troubling content. So this artist, John Rathman, figured out because these cameras are automated, they're immediately broadcast wirely to their data centers. And then there are these moderators that just monitor the stream of images that keep coming in. And whenever something weird happens, they delete it and send the car back out to rephotograph it. So John Rathman figured out if he just sits at his computer long enough, with like a case of Mountain Dew, just kind of sitting there, day after day, he'll occasionally find some weird ones that come through, and then he'll screen capture it. Like, I don't know, maybe a robbery, glitches. Yeah. So we pretty much take our surveilled world through digital imaging as a kind of fair representation of what the world is, when in fact it's heavily edited. And because it's heavily edited, it's not that far from what we call fiction. So the difference between fiction and nonfiction when it comes to imaging the world, I think, is becoming more and more fraught and difficult to determine. Which brings me to my friend here. You may know that this is a scene from like a professional wrestling mega event. And so, I mean, it's all about spectacle. And it might be interesting for you to read at some point Roland Barthes' essay on wrestling, on professional wrestling. When Trump got elected, a friend of mine sent me that essay. Maybe we should reread this to understand what's going on in politics today. And I think he was right. In some ways, politics today seems inhabited by characters that really don't belong to physical bodies, that somehow narrative and physical reality has delaminated. And when people come into celebrity or into power, it seems to be like a weird, most of the time, accidental inhabitation of characters that are already existing in culture. But beneath it all, I've been fascinated by not so much the meaning of the president's messaging, but more the data. When you look at the kind of fine print of, say, Donald Trump's Twitter feed, and this was already a year and a half old, I'm more interested in 58.4 million followers. Pretty much everything about the messaging here can be tabulated. So you can see this bizarre comment, which I don't even really understand. Like, I mean, I don't even know what it means. But 5,347 comments, 8,508 retweets. You see. What's astonishing to me about it is the exact count of all of this. And of course, you can drill deeper into exactly where all these people are, what else the people that are following it and commenting it, who else they're following. Probably they weren't, I would say 99.9% of people on this are not mindful of their digital privacy rights and have signed away their data for what they're buying, what they're surfing, so on. So can be this kind of extreme tabulation of the relationship between actual physical bodies in relationship to meaning. And then this affects everything from marketing to political elections. This is so fundamentally new. I think it's something everybody needs to pay attention to. The big difference is our general still relied upon methodologies of polling. You know how polling works. I don't know if any of you have ever picked up that spam call to actually answer the polling questions. I never have. I just hang up on them, right? But this is generally the way this has been done. In the past, there used to be something called Nielsen ratings. Let's see how many people in the United States watched Archie Bunker last night. Why do you need to do that? Because unless you know how many people the messages, the meaning is actually reaching, there's no way to know exactly how to price the advertising dollars. So that would be done by randomly calling people up on the phone. Now, and admittedly, very imprecise, but through statistical analysis, you can more or less ballpark it in a workable manner. But this is something so fundamentally new where you don't have to pull any more. We know exactly who's following it. We know exactly how many eyeballs it reached, and we know exactly where they all are. So I think there's plenty of stuff in the news about this. I think there's no end to the kind of public anxiety about the state of affairs. But I think it's important to know like what might be at stake and to what degree this telematic infrastructure has already been built out. And you may also know this is a photograph from Charlottesburg a couple of years ago, where there was that white nationalist protest. What you may not know was the entire thing was organized on Discord. There was, we know this because a New York Times reporter embedded himself in the Discord channel. And he asked a very, I think, profound question when he did publish the newspaper article about this, that we can basically assume the event would not have happened without platforms like this, because it simply would have cost too much money to be able to organize something of that scale. And because there are things like this that are free and widely accessible, it allows collectives to form and for meaning to proliferate in an altogether unpredictable way that we don't quite know how to deal with as a society. This is a map from Thomas Edsel, which I often show, from an article by Thomas Edsel, who's an op-ed writer for the New York Times. The article was called "Robots Can't Vote, but They Got Trump Elected." And what he meant by that was he looked at the study from MIT that did a kind of population count of where machines of automation are in the United States. And as you, if you look a little deeper into this, it pretty much maps onto all the states that flipped from blue to red in the last election. So basically, a lot of people are losing jobs and being put out of work. All of these issues have just magnified throughout the recent time. So finally, to AI, here's one of the first images that caught my eye. This is Google's Deep Dream, where basically they processed this painting by Van Gogh, this self-portrait, and basically they were attempting to see if their what was at the time a kind of primitive AI model, to see if it could recognize, do edge detection on the portrait. But the model they trained was, for some reason, on animals. Basically, they just scanned and built a model out of like a wildlife database. So strangely, like it just saw animals and eyes everywhere in the image. You know, like you're trained only to see eyes, and then you see eyes everywhere. You've also seen stuff like this. This is a lot of this is old news, you know, but I'm just trying to lay out for you the background of why I started going into some of the work we had been. So there was this funny moment at Christie's where an AI generated image sold for $432,000. And then it raised all kinds of questions of, is that an intellectual property infringement? You know, that is the people who made the original images upon which the AI processing was done, or is the intellectual property and the people who developed the code? What does it mean that the code is cobbled together from an open source endeavor with probably well over 200 authors if you track down everybody? So exactly what does ownership even mean? What does authorship mean in this era that we're entering into? I think these are fabulously interesting questions. I think we're all of us at SCI-Arc, I think, have all at some moment considered the problem of appropriation and authorship. We look at stuff all the time. We're influenced by stuff all the time. We make stuff made out of other stuff. This is just a normal way of working in the 21st century, I think. Elsewhere in culture, I've been just for a number of years just looking at all the various subcultures that have been emerging in the world of the internet. I don't think any of this would have happened without the internet. But one of the things you can observe about just the explosion of little cultures, each of whom had their own aesthetic logic, is primarily they're incorporating techniques of appropriation. Even in the language, like words start getting combined with other language. Words that once meant one thing get turned into another. Yes, there is a group out there that is about My Little Pony. Yeah. So many, and every year, more and more and more. So the political implications of this, I think, are important to consider. It seems pretty clear we're living in a society that is becoming more and more dependent, or maybe fully dependent on digital infrastructure. And one of the consequences of this is a kind of balkanization of cultures. Culture is breaking up into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces. They may not be such a thing as a big authoritative culture anymore. This brings me to this book that, this is from 1977. This was a report commissioned by the president of France, the Simone Nor and Alan Mink, to study the ramifications of the dependency of France on American-built infrastructure, that is, communications infrastructure. What they ended up reporting was what was noticeable already in 1977 was a convergence of the two big regimes of technology of the 20th century, computation and communication. And they proposed this new term, telematics, where computation and electronic communication becomes convergent to one thing. Eerily, I think, looking back on it from the year 2020, that sounds an awful lot like the internet. They warn that the coming society in this infrastructure, this new infrastructure, is a situation where everybody who's connected to that network has then the ability to upload or they use the word publish their own information. They warn that such a society would lead to a loss in faith in the institutions of information. And they warn that such a society might, in fact, be ungovernable. You can imagine, as I'm reading this, I'm getting chills up my spine, because much of this seems to have largely come to pass. Now, this wasn't merely just a written work, by academics. It then led within a year to a rollout through French Telecom of what was at that time called the Minitel system, which was a state-sponsored internet. So if you were in Paris, like I was in the early 90s, you would have seen one of these terminals. They basically told everybody who was on French Telecom, this year you can either have a telephone book or a computer terminal. And of course, you're gonna say computer terminal, right? But on this, you could check your grades at the state university, you could check the weather, you could get general news. And of course, there's never any doubt about the authority of that information because it's coming from the state. Now, eventually this would fail. And why? Because it couldn't compete with the internet, what we now know as the internet. They couldn't compete with on an economic and investment level with what was emerging in all the other countries, and the last Minitel was unplugged only about 5 years ago. So one of the things to maybe bear in mind as I finish the talk here today is at the end of Nora Mink's study, they propose a socialization of information. And you could see how the Minitel, I guess, embodies that. Now, we know what socialized medicine is, but I think we get the creeps when we think about the concept of socialized information, because that actually sounds like North Korea, doesn't it? That information is dictated by state authorities. But we always thought that kind of net neutrality or having freedom of publication and speech would lead to, I guess, greater degree of emancipation in the society relative information. But it's looking more and more like the opposite is happening with the kind of freewheeling world of media that we have. So that's been in the back of my mind, you know. It's not something I'm comfortable like advocating for yet, because I don't know what socialized information might mean exactly, because I'm certainly not interested in state propaganda, you know. But I think this is something we should all just contemplate in the coming years. So, okay, so let's get back to the world of design. I love showing these 4 images because I think you can immediately see the kind of history of influence and appropriation in architectural history. Even more recently, you know, you got the one on the right, that's a little house by Rem Koolhaas. And interestingly, he never mentions Villa Savoye when he speaks about this project, but it's so obviously a strange, sneaky commentary on Villa Savoye, because this house is also in the Parisian suburbs. So these days, like if you type in Le Corbusier 5 points, you get 1.760 million results in 0.62 seconds. I guess I could easily put this adjacent to my screen capture of Donald Trump's Twitter feed. Just the exactitude of the data is what stuns me all the time. I want to know what is going on there behind the curtain. What kind of machine is this that can find 1.7 million results in 0.62 seconds? And of course, it's artificial intelligence. And then the effect of it is a kind of strange junkyard of images, what the artist Hito Steyerl refers to as the debris field of images that constitutes contemporary culture. But what does this do to us, you know, as people that are trying to learn about architecture, produce architecture, when our own architectural history is becoming mechanized and delaminated from meaning? You know, what is that doing to our techniques and possible ways of working? I learned about this through Damian Jovanovic, where this person thought it would be a bright idea to use AI automation to produce iPhone covers. So basically, I trained a model and made an account on Amazon, where as soon as somebody clicks on purchasing one of the iPhone covers, which are kind of endlessly generated by the AI and posted onto Amazon, then a message is sent to a factory in China that then takes the image, puts it onto plastic, and mails it to the purchaser. But it was kind of a sloppy programmer, because it was trained weirdly on a medical database. And so you got strange glitches like this, or like this, or like this. Yeah. So you may have heard also like these bizarre unboxing videos on YouTube that kids obsess about. A lot of these YouTube videos are now being generated by AI. So we're beginning to see that a kind of cultural production that has that is outside of the domain of a human author that is producing work relative to linguistic meaning. It is a culture being produced out of a massive trove of data. Yeah. Some of which are good and some of which, most of which are not. So 3 years ago, I started offering these vertical studios at SCI-Arc, where all of this came down to, I thought, the most accessible entry point, which was the style transfer algorithm. The way it works is the algorithm is built on top of a neural network that is open source, actually, pre-trained. The neural network itself is around 6 gigabytes in size. It's a lot of data, actually. And the neural network is cleverly used to send 2 pieces of data through it. So one is an image. So this would be on the left side, the top image, the factory, which will be privileged for seeing edge segmentation and object detection. So, and they refer to that as, the programmers refer to that as the form image. Then a second image is sent through it that's processed for patterns in the image. And that's what the programmers call the style image. And then the neural network combines the two, the form and the style, resulting in something like the image on the right. So over the past 3 years, my students have been working with this, and there are a couple of things that are pretty weird about working with something like this for the first time. This was something I liked very much. The student took a photograph, which was a close-up of Lloyd's by Richard Rogers, and then combined in the style of late Baroque facade. I don't even remember what that was. And then you get this kind of late Baroque Richard Rogers thing. And then for the past 3 years, we've generally been just trying to develop techniques for how to start with a 2D image and slowly move towards the 3-dimensional. But throughout the process, one of the things that we had to confront is why even make 3 dimensions? Like, what is the purpose of that 3-dimensionality? This was something that started with the show we put into the SCI-Arc Gallery a few years ago. And it started out as a show about aerial photography and imaginary landscapes. But a bit late in it, we started, this was the very first time Karel and I started working with AI methods. It's John. I'm just going to skip ahead some of this to get to some of the points. Yeah, so here's one. And I was absolutely blown away by just the I don't know, the fidelity of the images that would result. These were not just blurry Photoshop blends between images. There was something utterly weird happening in the kind of results you would get through the AI techniques. This is a photograph, aerial photograph of Los Angeles that was AI processed, blended with an aerial photograph of the Himalayas. It's truly uncanny. Let's see. Yeah, this one was interesting. This is Manhattan. You could see Yankee Stadium in the middle, Upper Manhattan and the Bronx, with an aerial photograph from Eastern Africa. I'm just skipping ahead so that I could wrap up here. and give you a chance to ask some questions if you so want. Just some of the ones we did recently last year. So Hernan was asked to curate a show at the FRAC, and we thought it would be, I guess there was some humor in this. We took then the form of La Tourette, I guess worked with the style of Rheims Cathedral, two very well-known French buildings for a show in France. And yeah, and I'm still like amazed and perplexed by how it produces things in a way I would never be able to imagine. But to get an image like this, I basically ran it 100 times, and the rest of it just wasn't that interesting. So it still requires a human observer to cherry pick the ones that seem to have significance or interest. You know, so I guess some degree of the autonomy of the author as somebody that has the intellectual agenda and the aesthetic privileging of one type of composition over another is still very much in operation in terms of just picking the one that you like. And so I continue to be fascinated by how AI seems fully capable of simply substituting just the drudgery of design labor, but still and cannot seem to replace the authorial judgment that then has to nominate one of the results for other purposes. My brother-in-law, who's a programmer, he says, well, that's just a matter of time. Most likely it would be the bosses that will be replaced before the workers eventually. And I don't know what to make of that. That I find difficult to imagine. And here's some of the other ones in these series that we had done. Karel is in the middle of producing, I guess, more art with AI. And recently she's been making these, what she calls taxidermy, like AI-produced taxidermy. She calls these pelts, which she wants to actually make physically now using the AI-generated images as a template. Yeah, you know, I think this is probably a good place to stop. I could say a little more relative to any questions you might have. But for me, I think the primary question with the world of AI is I'm deliberately trying to get past whether or not there's an ethical judgment to be made about it. I'm more thinking in terms of what kinds of work can be substituted and replaced and what kind of work cannot be. And maybe even further, what kind of work that we insist is not substituted, and which might be more of a political question than a technical one. Okay, great. So thanks for listening. And I'm sorry, I can't hear you, Elena. I don't know if you're muted. Hello.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to thank you for a very thought-provoking lecture. I always enjoy your presence in the program, and also for showing us your work. I think it was great for me to see more iteration of the one I've seen for France. I actually didn't know the body of work behind it, so it was great for us to see as well. And I am going to read some of the questions that come from Jonathan Warner. Great lecture. I wonder what your opinions are on our highly talented culture, targeted culture. Do you think AI has a potential to operate society due to high tailored content?
Yeah, that's a sounds like a political question. I mean, to be honest, I wouldn't mind like our Congress being substituted by machines at this point. But I don't know, it's right now we're in the early stages of tools that are just robust enough to even bring the question up. That's why like I'm becoming more and more interested in AI models that deal with language more than images. So like for the vertical this year, I think I'm gonna make an attempt to transition away from image production and just see if we could experiment a little bit with like GPT-3. But and this is something that I think in the SCI-Arc world, Casey Ream, who's here, like he was pretty much the pioneer at SCI-Arc dealing with this stuff. I remember already like 4 years ago, there was that student that was, I guess, I don't know if it was real or not. I think it was somewhat technically real of having AI-based criticism, Yeah.
Yeah, we don't need to make stuff up. We're doing weird enough stuff as it is.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't think I can answer that. Yeah, it's something I'm trying to just pay attention to right now. I think a lot will just depend on what we insist on too. I mean, there are certain economic and political interests that would be fully in favor of automation of any kind, and I think this has generally been true for 300 years. The more human labor can be automated, the better from certain points of view. And then throughout that whole history, there's been great anxiety about this and insistence on maintaining human forms of labor in conflict with concepts of automation. Yeah, I wish I had a better answer for you, but I think it would be disingenuous of me to pretend like I actually knew the answer to that.
So Casey says it already has Brexit vote and Trump campaigns heavily utilizes NN classification for targeted propaganda.
Yeah, no. I mean, there's definitely that aspect of it, and Karel's brother, he has a pretty provocative AI startup here in LA, and he did tell me, off the record, they had to make an ethical decision this year about whether or not they would participate in a job that would involve the fall election, and they declined quite a big contract actually. But things like this are happening. Oh, Casey, you want to say more about what you wrote there?
I mean, that was literally at the heart of the Cambridge Analytica scandal in the UK, and that company morphed a couple of times. But was the reason why they were using all that data from Facebook was to train networks to create targeted propaganda for like really niche issues. So rather than kind of doing the blanket campaigning, they were doing really, really granular analysis of people's behaviors and tastes in order to specifically tap individuals' concerns around the issue. So rather than just doing like blanket covers, they're doing highly specific person-to-person type of propaganda and campaigning. That's a lot of the content that's on Facebook too.
I mean, as far as I know, these kinds of targeted techniques incorporating AI is far more developed now than they were 2 years ago.
I mean, and in general, the most advanced stuff in these types of things are in the kind of classification territory, because that's where there's the clear application of value. So compared to the kind of generative image production stuff, most of the money is on this kind of problem.
Yeah, I think hence the kind of anxiety and danger of how good GPT-3 seems to be now. Although, I mean, they are very much cherry picking the scariest and most effective results. Like it does produce a lot of nonsense, but but it is getting quite sophisticated, I must say.
I mean,
the whole controversy with TikTok right now is related to this because their algorithm is fundamentally different from Facebook's. What it looks like is the Facebook, Instagram algorithms were just targeted at maximizing connection. Just multiply what you're connected to as much as possible, just so because it's basically a marketing device. But TikTok seems to be doing something very different, where it's kind of siloing content and people, where it's not about exposing you to everything, but it's to figure out what it is that you like and keep you there. You know, which is politically very disturbing if you think about it. You know?
Yeah, I mean, that, like, going back to my question, I guess it's just, it kind of like exactly what you said. It's just the AI, the highly targeted AI is kind of scary to me because it takes people's scope and narrows it so much that you're not really exposed to any other opinions or content. So everybody gets pushed into these series of groups that stay separated, and you're never exposed to a new series or new opinions of content. So I think and I think now, especially in America, things like that politically are happening very much so. And
I'm a great believer in cosmopolitanism, which is why I can only live in cities. Just the ability to be exposed and confronted by the other is just, I don't know, like my life practice is so rooted in that, you know, this kind of exposure to the other. And I'm talking about just walking down the street of Manhattan in the 70s and seeing weird, fucked up shit and then being delighted by it, you know? And it affects who I become, and it affects my artistic practice. It affects my imagination. But I mean, to what degree can you trust that you have autonomy in what you're being exposed to today? As like all of you, as a designer, it's kind of garbage in, garbage out. Like what I see becomes my work. And having some degree of autonomy and agency in what I expose myself to, even if it's the random, I think it affects ultimately the work I produce and the ideologies I end up holding. But if things are being targeted towards me like a heat-seeking missile, you know, to what degree can you be sure that you're surfing what you want to surf, that you're reading the criticism you want to read? Some theorists would say, go so far as to say there is no such thing as criticism anymore, because what we have now is an apparatus of confirming the positions we already have. So when we search for criticism, what we're actually doing is finding the texts out there that reinforce what we already believe. And underlying that is a kind of artificially intelligent automation apparatus of meaning. So like, how do you expose yourself to the counter argument? To what degree do you have the ability to be persuaded by something else? That's, I think, is a kind of $1 million question for all of us, but particularly for the creative class. If we become more and more entrenched, no matter how well-meaning we are, I think it's problematic, because we just become one star in a constellation of ideas. And nothing ever changes.
David, isn't there like a kind of always kind of combinational factor to all this, like AI being this kind of conduit to niches? I mean, we're locating niches. I don't find it to be targeting more than when you put an overlay of politics or advertisement, then it seems like target. But really AI or whatever we're saying is somewhat of a niche to very, very specific locations that now you can almost bring in a cosmopolitan overlay into that niche. You know, you're kind of, I mean, it could be politics or it could be any sort of taste that ends up, you know, now we're mixing this, because you were talking about how it's also maybe denying this authoritative culture, which I think is wonderful, based fundamentally on the niche quality of this.
You know, it makes me remember in the late 60s, the French Situationists, they would subject themselves to these kind of games of randomly walking through a city to kind of question, say, your habit of always walking down the same street and going to the same store, meeting the same people in the same class of thought. And they thought the random drift, you know, through the city would then expose you to the other and break you out of your weird little bubble, right? And it makes me think, like, is something like a derive even possible on Google? You know, when you're, I would like to think, you know, if I could just take your position for something like just Googling and, you know, drifting through the world of information could be like randomly walking through the streets of Paris and I could discover new things, but it may not be, you know, because it's so targeted, you know. Certain results will come up and others won't, you know, and that's not fully under my control, you know. My habits of browsing are being recorded. You know,
Yeah,
you've noticed just the ads we ignore, but it's all there, you know, on the side. Yeah.
But the fact that it really could feel like it's in your locale could really soften it. In other words, I'm picturing almost like, you know, augmented reality in a ghost town, you know, or you can really start to create these cosmopolitan events that really feel like they might be there, or the fact that they even kind of have that allure. I mean, then you eradicate any sort of evangelistic quality about it. Like when you see the biblical scene in an aerial view and all of a sudden it takes out all the kind of, you know, super, you know, evangelistic subtext of it. So, I mean, you know, when it's just really brought into a convincing reality, I don't know, it just seems to be.
Yeah, it's a good point, Andrew, and I'm with you. I think like this is a political discussion that needs to happen, you know, like to what degree should these platforms be regulated, you know, just like our cities have been to promote some egalitarian space, you know, but as we know, even in our physical space, it hasn't been so egalitarian over the years. You know, there's been a lot of tension about this, you know, but for what it's worth, you know, as the urbanist Saskia Sassen points out, cities have historically been that space where the disempowered produce a new form of power. This is, you know, like it's Chinatown, you know, right? It's K-Town here. It's where the disenfranchised nonetheless still have a place where they can construct a constituency and a form of meaning that is not totally within the reach of power. But I don't see that kind of thing really happening on the internet, you know, quote unquote. You know, it seems like the opposite is more and more the trend. I mean, to some degree, maybe it's something that has happened beneath our consciousness. So I know there's a lot of discourse about this today, you know, so I mean, there is some reason to be hopeful that maybe some sort of intervention can and should happen, you know, but I think just because it's virtual, you know, that it's not the literal physical space of the city, it doesn't mean it's any less profound, you know, in its effects, I think. I mean, to bring it back to the world of thesis for a second, you know, I mean, we all do this, like you're trying to figure out like how to do your stuff and you look for influence, right? And where do you look for that influence? You do it through the screen. You know, look at this project, look at that project. I like this, I don't like this. You ended up spending more time looking at this and that's being recorded. The fact that you stayed longer on that Instagram feed or that website. You know, all the annoying buttons you got to push to agree to cookies, right? Today, now that we have some regulation about it, that's what that's about, you know, it's tracking it. And, you know, I think it's naive to think you're not being influenced by what you're seeing, you know, and to what degree is that kind of drift through the world of influence fair or not? If there's somebody else making money on what you're looking at and regulating in an unconscious way what you're being exposed to, I think that's reason to be concerned, you know?
Well, I mean, I just want to say, do you think, is AI getting a bad rap here? I mean, with this, I mean, as soon as we just process this grievance culture, that the assholes that voted for Trump and everything that we had to go through with that, as soon as we get over this grievance and all that, you know, maybe I just feel like it'll be a wonderful new world or something, you know. I mean, I'm naive, but you know, I'd hate to be bogged down in this particular, it seems like we're just finally processing the last bit of crap, you know.
Well, I would love to fire Mark Zuckerberg and put you in charge of Facebook. I kid you not. I think we would have a better world overnight. But I guess I don't want to be too much of a bummer about it. It's not that because obviously I'm like diving into this material and I'm fully like embracing working with this stuff. So I mean, this is kind of typical for my mode of work. Like I believe in being ultra critical, but also ultra expert, you know, simultaneously. You gotta work with it. You can't be a denialist, nostalgic, and I'm only gonna draw with my pencil, you know, like I'm being critical about it just so I could map other ways out of this. Otherwise, I think I'm just going with somebody else's map. You know? I don't want to just be a victim of marketing.
Yeah, David, I really appreciate the topics you brought up. I guess for me, I'm like a TikTok user. I'm like fully siloed in my niches. I also am aware of all these terrible things that it could happen, right? However, I have the privilege to like kind of just be like, okay, you know, like I have that choice. Maybe I don't know the full extent of like the future of AI. However, I do personally find that my position would be towards maybe in architecture, the possibility of AI being more accessible, like just for people who are differently abled. So like if architecture is like a visual culture, could we think of architecture through like sign language or like labor that humans need to translate the medium of like the visual medium of architecture into like a medium for a blind person or someone that is suffering from like some like sensory like effects. Like I find that like that's maybe a positive look at it. Or even just in architecture school, when we make models, is there a way where, I mean there is, but like the ways that we don't, the ways that you like look at your image and you can just select the input and then it makes a thing. If there's a way to produce like physical objects from that, maybe like the robot lab is a suggestion of something like that. But like actually being in vertical studio and you don't actually move your hands, you just like sit in a chair and like your eyes do everything. You know, like I wonder what would that look like as a school, because then you wouldn't have to really, the studio might be a little more comfortable. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I see no reason why these forms of automation are off the table. I mean, it's just a matter of there being enough of a user base for it. I mean, like everything else in a capitalist society, it's just, I think whatever becomes economically viable is inevitable. I don't think there's anything about this stuff that precludes scenarios like that. I guess for me, the thing that is more forefront for me is the fact that I didn't have the ability to imagine the images. It's not just a matter of time that I needed to produce those images. I just wouldn't have been able to even see it, you know? So it's not merely substituting some form of labor I have or a group of people could have. It's just presenting an entirely new form of labor too. You know? So what the implications of that are probably both positive and negative. You know, like there is some aspect of it that opens up new territory. I guess that's more like on the side of Andrew. Like something can be renewed through that, but at the same time, it is also substituting certain things and taking away too. So I think we just have to, I don't want to be too idealistic about it or completely negative either, and say, just don't do it and ban it. Like, I think that's silly too. Because it sees something I didn't see, I feel like it's not properly speaking merely a tool, and that's one of the positions people have that, oh, it's just another tool, like, yeah, like you can have rendered the image through ray tracing anyway. I mean, no matter how much time you had, you wouldn't have produced that exact thing, right? But there's something a little different about these new AI-based techniques. They're not just a technique, it's something else too. I don't know, Damian,
No,
do you think that's right? I'm just curious, Damian, like if you agree with what I just said.
I agree. I think to me also, I agree. I also like Vincent's comment. To kind of have another way of working would be really interesting. But I think, the problem with that, I think, is that someone has to make that first. This is one of the things that we don't have. We don't have those kinds of other ways of engaging with technology because no one has made them. And it's not so. One of the things that come out of the discussion, as I see it, is that we are still, as a discipline, we're still waiting for someone else to kind of give us the tools, right? And I think it's more interesting to make it, or to kind of at least imagine it and then see what's going to happen. Because that's why I want to say to Vincent, like, make it. I would like to work on that, in some ways, like if there is a way to visualize space for blind people or something like that. But someone has to make that. Someone has to like design it. Someone has to make a technology that will work with that. Otherwise, it just remains a cool idea. So it's the same. I think it's the same thing with AI. I think if we are using those tools in the way that are given to us, I think it's just we are always in the wake, or how do you say it, like in the background of the stream or of the wave. I think it's much more interesting as an architect to invent new ways of engaging with the world, I think. So I totally agree with everything, but what is missing from my point of view is this aspect of someone proposing, oh, this is what it should be. Because we have like GAN breather, we have Arc breather, we have like these kind of web tools, we have Pix2Pix, all of these technologies, but no one is saying, so how can we make this work as a software for architects, or as an interface? What does it mean to interface? What does it mean to go away from like the graphical user interface into new modes of thinking about content, and about like what happens with like billions of images that everyone sorts through? Do we want images? Do we want something else? Is it like, so it's just a matter of like, I guess everyone knows what is out there, but few people know what's next. And that's why Zuckerberg is Zuckerberg, right? Just to go back to what you were saying to Andrew about him replacing Zuckerberg, it's being there in 2004 and like predicting. I think that's where it's at somehow. And that's design. We should invite Zuckerberg to talk to us.
I'd like to offer one other thought here too, because I'm seeing like there's some questions and just the perspective on like, all right, like how do we actually make a fully formed physical thing? And I think that's an appropriate kind of like way of thinking, in an architecture talk. Like the end game or the teleology of architecture is that final fabricated physical thing, like be it a building or your model or whatever. But I think in most other fields, the teleology is the decision. Like, did this regime of technology enable us to make a good decision? Think about like AI being used by politicians, for example, or marketing executives, or solve, right? Like being able to make the proper decision that's really the end, you know? And I don't think that's an insignificant issue for us too, you know? Like what we ultimately decided to do with the design or whatever creative decision needed to be made. And sometimes that will involve the physical final form, physical object, but sometimes it's not that, I think. It may be other things too. So I'm more, yeah, go ahead, please.
Ask you a question, just sort of that's like around what you're saying. I'm really interested in that kind of like there's like the sort of subject of like statecraft with AI, and I'm curious for your take on like the project CyberSign that was like, of course, you know, this kind of like socialist project, but also like a scaffold for a fiction. And I'm curious, like, if for you, like the kind of AI is like always real, like it's always like happening in the real instead of like with most software things, you know, like people who like make software are like, yeah, like, no, your information isn't secure because you're like asking me to like make it secure. And like, I don't know what I'm doing. Like, that's what, like, you know, even like computer security is like, you're like, what are you going to do? You know, like every computer is connected to all the other, like everything that you do is just this continual sort of scaffolding of security that is like a continually moving wall. So I'm curious about like how, for your take on kind of Project CyberSign and that kind of the kind of like statecraft through a kind of AI interface sort of project.
I don't know enough about CyberSign, but I can say like I think pretty much all statecraft today is database. You know? It's, I mean, look at our world right now with R0, R1, you know, and how many, you know, it's just nonstop counting. And the countries that seem to have better data is just doing better, you know, during this. But I think it's remarkable, like, you know, back in February, you know, on the basis of one model by the Imperial College, you know, based on what's turned out to be, and they themselves admit now, flawed data, which is based on flu, right? They made this projection that 2 million people could die, you know, this year, right, in the United States. You know? And okay, and then everybody shut down after this study came out, right? Now, regardless of just this particular, the meaning of this particular moment, I think it was remarkable that such world-changing decisions were made on the basis of data and data modeling. And I think we're just in another, maybe this event has kind of finally pushed us over the edge and fully embracing the sovereignty of data practices. So yeah, I mean, I guess that's my general take on what you bring up, Jesse, which I think is a pretty important point, you know, about statecraft in the 21st century. I think, you know, data is a resource like oil was in the last century.
We have another question from Jackie. Provocative lecture, David. AI needs an armature to latch onto. Do you think that armature, whether it is an image building idea, is where manipulation design can happen? Can we trick AI?
I'm trying to parse it. Could you tell me more about your question, Jackie? I'd like to understand.
I was just thinking about how AI is, I mean, it, you know, when you're working with the neural networks, I know that Karel describes a lot of the work as being collaborative, right? That you are collaborating with the machine in a way, right? And so I think there must be some agency to setting up the thing that the AI latches onto, the thing that the AI is trying to manipulate or trying to reassess or transform in a way. And so it makes me wonder if you were to, I mean, if we were thinking about ourselves and how we get, bombarded with ads, if we were to project a different self out there, in a way that's a kind of design in a way, like you're anticipating a different individual, right? So the AI might start to, target to that entity.
Yeah, trick it, in other words.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I think that design can be a form of trickery with AI.
Well, I think that's proven to be a very useful critical technique over the years, and misdirection, trickery. Maybe not statecraft, but tradecraft, like the techniques of the spy. But I don't know. Like Karel and I, we have a different opinion about this. I know Karel feels very strongly about collaborating with AI, but I guess I take a more hardline position on it. Unless I allow my collaborator to make the decision sometimes, they're not really a collaborator. If I'm the one who always makes the decision, no matter how much they work, they're not really a collaborator, but they're just a worker for me. So for me, it's not really about who's doing the work. It's more about who's making the decision. And if I'm always the one to decide this result, not that, it's not really a collaboration, I think. Which raises other points, like Karel's brother, Bill, the programmer, the AI programmer, he actually thinks we should move towards giving rights, actual rights to AI models. And he admits, like, that's not our world yet. And it was interesting to hear his reasoning for this. His point of view is not whether or not AI models are human or not. It's more that we depend on it, and everything we depend on ought to have rights, even if it's not human, which is an interesting point. I think jury's out on this. We might. I guess I'm a little fearful. We may think we're tricking it, but that too is becoming absorbed as data.
Right. Yeah. At some point that gets absorbed and then we all just blow up, right?
Well, it reminds me of this hilarious interview I once saw of Stu Albert, who was the leader of the Yippie Party in the 60s. I mean, that's when the hippies were a political party. Nobody remembers this anymore. But he said, yeah, it just kind of petered out, and say, why did it peter out? And it's like, well, I don't know. At some point, people started making shit I wanted to buy. And I thought that was so profoundly sad, Like you're fighting the power against capitalism, but then like somehow that posture has been absorbed and companies started making stuff even for them. It's really paradoxical, ironic, tragic. I mean, one thing about those subcultures I showed, they're buying all of their equipage, even the health jobs with the upside down logo, they're buying all those things on Amazon.
So there is also another question from Damien. David, about database, do you think we are unequipped to deal with this new technical regime with the existing common architectural tools and techniques?
Oh, that sounds like a leading question for sure. I know what you think. Yeah, it is. It is. I mean, we need to get up to speed. I think we were very.
I think we are.
I think we were incredibly distracted by a discourse of returning to disciplinary history during the past 10 years. Like a lot of other spheres of politics, and like a lot of other creative practices, some more than others, but architecture has been particularly noticeable in its nostalgia in the past 10 years. I mean, because we saw all this coming, of course. I remember Peter Eisman's lecture where he's calling for a return to the discipline 10 years ago, where he said it's because of what media is doing to us. You know, so he was quite prescient about it, but I guess he had a different attitude too, because he thought like we were all losing our way because of our distraction. You know, when in fact, I think what was emerging through the medium was a new form of reality, you know, not mere distraction. So I think the sooner we, you know, let go of that kind of, I don't know, melancholy about the loss of our previous lived experiences and look a little closer at our actual living experiences of today and interrogate and critique it and rip open the hood of that car and study its machinery, I don't think we're really dealing with what's going on right now. You know?
So
but I'm very anxious about it, as you could see. It's not all positive, I don't think.
On this anxiety question, maybe we want to wrap up this lecture. Thank you again, David, for your generosity and intellectual provocation, and for engaging our students and in their questions, and also our faculty. So thank you all. I'm going to leave this to Florenza. You have an announcement for tonight?
Yes. Thank you, David. I was putting it in the chat, but so Damian, are you there?
Yes,
so everybody, we have a movie night tonight. We have Paprika, which I think in a way connects to a lot of this stuff.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
No,
so, fantastic.
I think that it makes total sense. So I would say students go now watch the movie and then 6 o'clock check in with us. But I think it's it's a wonderful movie. So thank you, David, again. And, I mean, the world will be taken over according to Paprika. But yes, thanks.
Thank you so much. Bye, guys.
Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.